Well, I'm known primarily as a gun guy, and that's the truth. That is my primary area of expertise. I've made a living at it for 30 years. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a real history nerd. I love all history. I enjoy all historical weapons, and I've used them all from stone axes right up to M4s. But there are some that I like better than others. Today, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you about my favorite swords. I own a number of swords, but these four are my favorite. They represent the time periods that I enjoy the most. So we'll start off with this Viking sword. This would have been in use from about the 6th or 7th century, right up until the 11th century. The oldest type of sword in my collection is this Viking sword. And this particular one is made by cold steel. It's got a 32.5-inch blade, very narrow fuller, this area in here. It kind of resembles Jen Pedersen's Type X in his typology of these swords, but not quite. It's not really an exact replica of any historical sword. It just kind of matches the type. And these swords are fascinating to me because, of course, it's kind of the origin of the European sword. Right? These evolved out of the Roman Spatha. And the Roman Spatha was the sword that basically replaced the gladius, the Roman short sword, in the empire. The gladius was the sword of the republic, you might say, and the Spatha was the sword of the empire. And it was a long, slashing sword, but it really had no guard. Right? What it had was a wide spot in the hilt to keep your hand from sliding over the blade under the force of impact. But that was changed in Merovingian France in the 6th or 7th century. It began to develop into what we call the Viking sword now. It was really the Merovingian sword or the Frankish sword. But it developed a more rudimentary handguard, developed the 5-lobe pommel that you see on this. And these swords were exported all over Northern Europe, and they became quite the thing. So you'll find them in England, the Anglo-Saxon countries. You'll find them in Scandinavia and Germany. And the Scandinavians had some excellent swordsmiths. So the sword developed basically from the Spatha into this and continued to develop. Now, this has a blade made of 1055 high carbon steel. It's fully sharpened. And even though I have thought about getting a more historically correct Viking sword, because there are some excellent ones made by Albion and some other companies. Windlass even has some good ones that look exactly like the true Viking swords. This is a little bit off. But I've got to say, this has been one of the best swords in my collection. It's very, very fast. It's got a lively blade, got good balance. It's been strong. I know when it comes to cold steel, the results can be a little bit mixed, right? I mean, some people get bad ones. I've read bad reviews. I've read good reviews. It seems like if you get a bad one, you definitely have a bad one. But if you get a good one, you've got a very good sword indeed. And this has been a very good one for me. It's held up well. It's never loosened up. Anyway, it is one of my favorite swords. So chronologically, the next sword in the collection would be this arming sword, medieval arming sword. They're also called the knightly sword sometimes. And these would have been in use from the 11th century right up until the 16th century. And you can even find some 10th century examples that are pretty close. So moving up historically, the next sword in my collection, my favorites, would be this arming sword. And arming sword's a generic term for the typical knightly sword of the Middle Ages, right? This is what Sir Michael would have used back in the Middle Ages. Now this particular one is made by Windlass, and it's part of their Battlecry line. It's the Acre Broadsword, Acre Crusader Broadsword, something like that, right? And it's got this antique blued finish on it. And the reason it has this is because it makes it cheaper to produce. So a fully polished blade like this would probably have cost $100 more. Right, so for about $250, and I think the MSRP on this is like $350, but you can always find them for $250. You can get a very good arming sword, fully sharpened, battle ready. It's got a full tang. It has a peened pommel, which is much better than a screwed-on pommel. That's the way they made them in the day. It's just not shiny. So this would be Ewart Oakeshot's typology, his Type 10, Type X 10. And Ewart Oakeshott was an archaeologist, historian, who developed a typology for middle-aged sword blades and hilts. So he can place them culturally in the right time period, the right location. So anything you dig up, you can compare to his typology. So this matches his Type 10 sword. These were Norman swords. They're very early in the period of what we would call out of the Dark Ages into the High Middle Ages. These would have been really 11th century swords. They were favored by the Normans. So, for me, my personal favorite period of the Middle Ages is from the Norman conquest up through the sons of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, John, Magna Carta, that sort of thing. I like the later periods as well, the Edwards in English history. But my favorite is definitely, the anarchy with Matilda and Stephen of Blois and Henry II's rise to power. To me, it's just a classic time. And this would have been the sword for that. It's a one-hand sword, disc pommel. Has a excellent balance. A little bit heavy. It's a slashing sword. It's supposed to be. It has a serviceable point, and this would have been a sword that would have been used against chainmail or unarmored people. And you got to remember, back when swords were being used, swords were not the primary weapon. Primary weapon was a spear or a lance. If you were a knight, you had a lance on your horse, and that was your primary weapon until it got broken, or you threw it at somebody, or it got stuck in somebody's body and you had to let it go. And then this is the equivalent of basically pulling out a pistol, to defend yourself and fight your way through the rest of the battle. So you can see it's got this cross guard. Does not provide a whole lot of protection to the hand, right? If you're, blocking, but it gives you a lot more protection than a Spatha or than a Viking sword. But your fingers are still pretty vulnerable. But overall, this is an excellent sword. It's held up very well. Edges held up. It comes fully sharpened. And it's just a sword I really like. So the next sword in my favorite lineup would be the hand and a half sword. And this, of course, is a much bigger sword than the arming sword. It's from a later period. This would have been from the late 14th century up through the 16th century. Sometimes you'll see them used later than that. So as I said, my favorite historical period for the Middle Ages is the period from, say 1050 up until maybe 1300. More like 1225, to be honest with you. This is probably my favorite period, but then I still enjoy the High Middle Ages, the history of it. The weapon's not always so much, but I do have a sword I like quite a bit. This is a hand and a half. It'd be called a bastard sword, or it could be called a long sword. You see these a lot in fantasy movies. Right? The beauty of this is, as a hand and a half sword, you can get two hands on it, which gives you just a lot of leverage. But you can still manipulate it with one hand. even though it has a pretty long blade. I mean, this would be about a 36-inch blade. Once again, it's a high carbon steel, 1065, 1095 alloy, high carbon steel. It is also fully sharpened, battle-ready sword. So it's one you can have quite a bit of fun with. These guys had a lot of leverage because by the time these came along, in the 14th and 15th century, armor was getting a lot better. There was a lot more plate armor. Chainmail was much better than it had been earlier in the Middle Ages. So my arming sword would have a harder time with the modern chainmail. Couldn't slash it as well. And it would have no luck at all against plate mail. But this sword has a very good point. Right, so it's good for the thrust against plate mail into the crevices, and also because you can use it with two hands, and it does have such a long reach. It's got a very powerful slash, so it's a very good cutter as well. So you could cut through good chainmail with this, with a strong slash. You could break bones with it if you didn't cut through. So this is what we would see in the later Middle Ages. To me, this blade balances better if you get a finger over the crossguard. And that just gives you a better control of the blade. Now the problem is, of course, that finger is also easy to take off, which is why, as we got into the Renaissance period, you start seeing guards change quite a bit. Which brings us to the last of my favorite swords, the English backsword. And this particular one has a full basket hilt, which I actually like quite a bit. So the last sword I want to show you today is my English backsword. Now this would have come into vogue in the Tudor years in England. So Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth. This would have been very popular then, right up into the 18th century. As a backsword, it only has a single edge. Okay, so it's got a single sharp edge and a good point. And this would have been out at the same time as, say, the rapier would have been. But unlike a rapier, which is really just a dueling sword, a sword-on-sword type of weapon, backswords were useful for dueling and on the battlefield. So this was a very versatile sword. Now, one of the things about this backsword is it has a full basket hilt. And that can be a little slow. Right? I mean, you've got to be able to get your hand in. There's only one way in. But it provides absolutely wonderful protection for your hand when you're fighting. And of course, these were used in an age when people weren't using shields anymore. Right? So you really did need some good hand protection. Now, this is also from cold steel, and it has an excellent blade. It's very fast, very light, very easy to control, good for the thrust, good for the slash. If you're interested in Renaissance blades, this is a great choice, I think. You can cover a lot of ground with this as far as the time period it was used in. And it's also just a great sword to have. I mean, just in case swords come back in vogue again, this is the one that I would want to have. Because this is a very good general purpose sword. So these are my favorite swords. I've got others, but I don't like them as much as these. And these represent really the whole run of the Middle Ages. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed showing them to you. So until next time, bye. Well, I don't expect to do a whole lot of sword stuff on my channel. Like I said, I'm basically a gun guy. But if you're interested in swords, there are 3 channels that I can recommend here on YouTube that I spend actually quite a bit of time on. So these guys know their stuff, and if you don't already look at him, I recommend that you do. The first one is channel is Scalagrim, and he's a Canadian, and he's quite excellent. Also, I really like Todd's Workshop. It's Todd Cutler who does that. He's an excellent craftsman, and he is just a wealth of knowledge on weapons and on the Middle Ages. And the final one is Matt Easton, and his channel is Scala Gladiatoria. And he is more into 19th century British military weapons. That's his main area of expertise. But he covers the full gamut of edged weapons, and he's extremely knowledgeable. So these are guys that I recommend that you take a look at if you want to see more sword stuff. Well, I hope you liked this video. I know it's something a little bit different for this channel. But if you did like it, give it a thumbs up. And if you like the other stuff we have, I hope you'll subscribe. And if you're a subscriber and you want to support the channel, you can do that on Patreon. And if you are a Patreon supporter, I give you all my thanks. You make all of this possible, and I really do appreciate it. So, until next time, I'll see you.